Cool. I'll share my, okay, I can't share my screen.
Good.
All right, let me share my screen. And this is going to be the motion. Yes, so the motion reads, this House would mandate gender budgeting in India at the cost of targeted and exclusive policies for women. Now, I think we were starting the discussion as to what mandating gender budgeting in India is going to look like. I think Aditya came up with an idea. Could you just like repeat that idea?
The idea about giving examples of models of different countries.
Correct.
That one.
So in case if you like give the example, okay, which country were you trying to give an example for?
Australia and South Africa.
Correct. So and that's a good example, right? And then what would you say that this is what happens in Australia, and then that's exactly why we should have it in India, or how would your approach look like?
So I wouldn't compare this is what happens in Australia and this is what happens in India, because India is a developing country. So this is what's happening in Australia, and an idea of this can be taken and implemented on India, depending on what the conditions are in India suitable for.
Cool. So that's a great way to go about it, but I want to like make it open to the discussion. What do you think if anyone comes up with the idea that we should probably take ideas from other nations and implement it in India? What could be the possible rebuttal to that? Just raise your hand and let me know. Okay, Sudarshan has an answer.
Yeah,
Aditya himself has the answer to that. Okay. Yeah, Sudarshan.
So first of all, with another country, just like how Aditya said, India is a developing country, Australia is a developed country. The economy is different, the population is different, and like the situation is different. So like opposition can rebut by saying that we can't just easily take an action that is being used in another country with a completely different scenario. In like, yeah. So.
Okay, so you're saying that basically in terms of implementation, we don't necessarily know whether there's going to be good results coming out in India as opposed to what has happened in different other nations because of the inherent nature of like both the nations being different. Correct. That could be a good answer. Advait?
Just two things. One, firstly, yeah, I mean, like the previous speaker has pointed out, firstly, India's developing, and second of all, taking into consideration the population, it is the second largest country with the, I mean, this country has the second largest population in the world. And it's very hard to implement any laws in this country because to be able to keep track of so many people and whether they're keeping track of these laws is very, very hard. And on top of that, it's not really that you can you can't really say that that country is implementing this, so you have to implement this, because India is still developing, first of all, and second of all, from like a really long time. I know it's wrong, but in India, how it's been is that men are the people who usually do the work, and that's how it's been going on for a really long time. So suppose families, which this is a hypothetical situation. So imagine a country in which men, imagine a household in which the male, like the father or the husband, goes to work, only him, because the wife is not educated or maybe doesn't know how to work. Then how, if you equalize this part and say that no, this particular person cannot be paid more than how much his wife would if the wife would join the particular industry, that would be unfair because that particular household is relying on that particular male. And if you remove the fact that he's getting paid a little more than the average female, then how is that entire family going to live upon that that salary which is maintained because of equality?
I think the one thing that you need to understand is that when we talk about like equal wages for women and males, I think the preconceived notion behind that is that you cannot necessarily reduce the payment of males in order to have equal payment for females. So whatever males are getting in the status quo, it's just going to be the case that females' wages are going to be equal. So I don't think like why you would say that, how is that guy now going to be able to sustain his family? If you understood what I'm saying. So like males, and that's also like the case for like I think acts like Equal Remuneration Act and stuff like that. So you cannot necessarily like say, so in case if in order to implement that policy of having equal wages for women and male, that means that they are not going to reduce the existing wages for males in order to have like equal wages so that like they are on the same page. And therefore I don't think it would impact males as much, specifically to this criteria.
Got it.
Cool. Aditya, what's your response?
One I would say was just that the problems are completely different. So one problem would be in India is you'll have to build up from ground up. First, educate women and also educate families about female infanticide. So first you need to increase the population of women to such that the sex ratio decreases, and then you need to educate them. So obviously the whole model you're going to implement is going to be completely different. So there'll be problems which outweigh much more. So the government needs to allocate much more funds to educate people about the female child, then have a budget on equality. So first they need to get that, and then they should go on. So there are many steps missing if you can't jump to another model.
Okay, so yours, that's a fair point, but I have a rebuttal to that. But before that, does anyone else think that it can be responded, what Aditya said? Like going for education and awareness before actually implementing this policy. So
I think like a possible rebuttal point would be several generations of India, several cultures, like it's there in their religious scripts, and like it's just that mindset that's there, that some religions and cultures believe that women should not like work, and it's like they should be given other responsibilities. So even if we educate, like religion is always like something that's inscribed and that's really powerful, like people can't just easily change from like that religious perspective.
okay, so if you were on op, you would say no. If you would be on prop, you're going to say that religion is always existing. Therefore, even if you educate people, it's not going to make a big difference.
Yeah,
correct?
exactly.
It's more of a culture
Does
than
anyone want to?
religion,
Yeah.
because religion is something which like it's been passed on in terms of whichever Hinduism or Christianity, but then culture would be something for that particular area which has been implemented. Because I think that in religious texts, I don't think it's mentioned anywhere that women cannot work.
Okay.
I kind of contradict Advait. So I remember the topic for one of the qualifier rounds was this house believes that the Mahabharata and Ramayana should be taught in school. So I went against that motion. And while I was reading, it just shows how much Indian epics objectify women. Like the whole
Yeah.
concept of that time was objectifying women, and it still happens in Haryana and all. So to remove that whole thing, it's going to take a lot of time.
Okay. So does anyone have a response to, oh, religion exists and people are never going to be adapting to the situation? Think.
I guess reforms in religion can always be made, and one is opening people's minds. So I guess people are so blindly following things, unless they're educated, they can't open up about it. So for example, just say any religion, there's an equal number of goddesses as there are gods, but still people always believe in patriarchal societies. But in India, there's still matriarchal societies. So we need to bring that change where you can say, hey, even matriarchal societies can exist, and they are as important as patriarchal societies.
Another thing, but Aditya, you said that equally as many goddesses as gods. Well, like several religions in India are monotheistic. Like Hinduism is just like kind of the only polytheistic religion.
Okay.
So
yeah, so my understanding of religion and the way how you can respond to these claims is basically like proving that that harm is not exclusive to your side. I'm unsure as to why religion is not going to exist in either side. It's going to exist in either side. And therefore, the harms of adapting to both the policies are going to regardlessly exist, which means that irrespective of whether you have gender budgeting, people are still going to believe in religious values as opposed to the having exclusive policies in opposition, because people are still going to have religious values. Therefore, the impact of that argument reduces to a really huge extent. So whenever you see things which you cannot probably counter to, I think one way to do that is a very good way, that is like education. I think to counter that claim, you can say that, look, I think religions have been able to liberalize through the idea of, let's say, globalization and through the idea of like education. And this is exactly why we think that religions and like ability to reform cultures still exist. Therefore, the idea from opposition that, look, religions are never going to let you adapt to these policies, I think gets away with when you talk about education. That's how you standardize that argument of education. But secondly, you can also talk about like how the religious argument in and of itself is like very, is not exclusive to either sides. And therefore, it doesn't really have that impact. But the next thing that I wanted to say, and that's something which I had in my mind in terms of response to the gender budgeting, when somebody talked about you know what, we should have like education for people so that they know that, you know, female, like they are aware of females and everything. I think it can still happen in gender budgeting. I'm unsure like why. And I think that's exactly why your policy in proposition is very important. So what you can do in proposition, and you can go ahead with saying that, look, when we talk about gender budgeting, and I don't want to give you the policy, I want you all to like use your brains. So yeah, so I think you can still talk about like how when it comes to education as well, and because you're having gender budgeting, we can allocate some amount of money simply in order to educate females and educate people who are coming from rural backgrounds, so that they are aware of, and probably we can have like campaigns and stuff like that. So when they're like allocating budget for let's say social movements or like basically campaigns that governments conduct, I think specifically they're going to have some amount of budget allocated to let's say about women empowerment or like women awareness, sanitation about women. So everything of that area can still come under proposition, and that's exactly why you are supposed to think creatively when you're making that policy clear as to what gender budgeting is going to look like. Now, after what I've said, I want you all to like brainstorm again and think of like what is the like key difference with respect to gender budgeting and having inclusive policy. Like, what do you think what is the specific difference?
Between gender budgeting and inclusive policies.
Exclusive policies, yes. And I want like others to speak as well. I think there are 12 members. Sachi, Meher, Khushi, Sudarshan. I think Sudarshan is already talking. Arna. If you all think the motion is like really difficult, I'll choose another motion and go with that. But we'll finish this one and like get a concrete idea of what kind of policy could be. And I think this is the motion that we chose because I think the motion that you're going to see in terms of India and in terms of semi-finals and finals are probably going to be similar to this. So
I got two policies for the proposition.
okay, go ahead.
So so this is not a speech, but if I had a speech, I would be talking first about the model. But now I don't. So should I talk about that or should I leave that?
I mean, I think like if it were to be a speech, you're first supposed to talk about like why we are having this debate in the first place. Like,
Yeah, but
what
I don't
problem-
think I didn't do a whole because I thought we were gonna have just a discussion. So
No. Yeah, so I was just telling you in case if you were asking about how you should start. Yes, that's how it would be. But yeah, you can start with the policy straight away.
okay, so I had two policies. One was is that we should collating gender disaggregated data. So a system should be set up to collate gender disaggregated data from relevant departments to obtain the gender-wise relevant statistical database targets and indicators. And so we can have a gender audit of plans, policies, and programs of various ministries with pro-women allocations. And this will help in the evaluation of the progress. And my second policy would be to segregate the provision. So segregations for of provisions for women. So segregate the provisions of women in the composite program under education, health, and rural development sectors, which target girls and women as the principal beneficiaries. This segregation of the provisions is important to protect the provisions by placing restrictions on their reappropriation for other purposes. It is necessary to ensure that the funds so earmarked are spent on the intended purposes. The point sought to be made is that if the expectations set forth in the budget are achieved, if even partially, the end results are bound to be positive. The absence of such identification in the provisions of related targets, on the contrary, greatly vitiates the implementation of the programs as being observed over the years. So essentially what I would be trying, so I try to find hard. So these are the two policies I was finding. So basically, in simple words, two policies would be: one is that to collect as much data possible from ministries for women to identify what's the program and what's the progress happening when you have gender budgeting. And the second would be to have budget and inside that segregation where women and girls would be the principal beneficiaries of that policy, or basically the budget.
Okay, I think that was really smart, the first part of the policy. And I also want to tell you that like when you're on proposition or for that matter, any side, don't call it like two policies. Say that I have one policy and there are layers to the policies. The first step is going to be like coming up, unless and until you were planning to tell me like two different options and you'll run either. I think like both of them can be actually like collaborated. So what you can say is like we have three layers in our policy. The first is going to be we collecting the statistical data. And I also think that you can link it back to the statistical data and how it's going to help you. For example, you could have started with like saying that, look, we are going to first take the statistical data from each kind of ministry, and then we're going to see as to like where the gender actually needs that amount of like budgeting. For example, if they think that the ratio in terms of the education in female in a particular area is extremely low, then we are going to allocate budget in that particular area with respect to that. And then if you think that in a particular place, the sanitation is like essentially very low, we are going to have specific like targeted budgeting with respect to that. So I think like you can again like link it back and then have like prove as to like what your second element of the policy was talking about, like why it's essential that you will get good results. I think that's pretty good. I think that's a good policy to run.
Yeah, you had previously asked like what's the difference between gender budgeting and exclusive policies. So I'm not really sure, but I think gender budgeting is like according to like specifically gender. For example, women need like maternity leave and taking all those stuff into consideration, like making your budgets, while exclusive policies is just blindly saying that, okay, so I'm going to give 75% of like my budget to women and 25% of like it to men, like something like that.
Okay. Amy,
I'm
do you
not-
have to say something?
I'm not. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
they said that the previous speaker just said that money could be put when they were defining gender budgeting. They said money could be put towards sanitation. Let's say, is sanitation not a universal right? Are women only the one who's supposed to be sanitated? That doesn't fall under the definition. That's what I'm saying.
I think that again links back to why women probably need it more, and that would link it back to their initial step of why they need to create that criteria, or like why they need to have that reasonable bias against women as opposed to males. I obviously like agree that like sanitation is a universal right, but you would have to tell and have to principally justify as to like why is it okay for us as government to prioritize sanitation of women as opposed to males, if that makes sense. So that's why the first part of the policy makes a lot of sense, because like that's the time when you're justifying why you're doing what you're doing.
I had a question also while I was going through is that I didn't say it right now, but for example, my first part of the policy, I said that, and then I would say is that how it's worked in another country. So basically in Australia, it was the first country to develop a gender sensitive budget, and it was way back in 1984. And the form in which they worked it out was it took place in Australia, where a model, each government agency was required to provide a gender audit, like I said. And then it was emphasized to departments that a comprehensive gender analysis, a mainstream public expenditure were relevant, and not just the expenditures directly allotted to women and girls. So through this, they found out that specifically targeted to women and girls in Australia made only less than 1% of the total budget. So just giving exclusive policies does not understand what's happening at the ground. Whereas when you get this, we understand what's lacking where, and we can hence push in more money over there.
Yep, that's great. I mean, that would make it the third layer of analysis to your budget and as to why your no third layer of analysis to your policy and why that is a good policy to have.
A little complex question, but when I'm giving a policy in the semifinals or finals, how many layers should I have to a policy? Should it just be like, or should I go continuously on? For example, if I'm first speaker, how much time should I spend on the policy itself?
I think the policy should not take more than 1.5 minutes. And it also depends on which category are you in?
7th to 9th.
Okay, so you have 5 minutes in total. I think 1 minute should be fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I think because like just defining the policy is not enough. You still have to give like an argumentation as to why that. So you would have to do at least 2 things properly, and that's extremely important for the first speaker. Firstly, justifying and then giving the policy, and then having some amount of argumentation. Then you can automatically divide as to how you want the speech to be.
Understood.
Yeah. Cool. Then, yeah, so I think exclusive policy, like what kind of policies do you come across when you're talking about women? Like, I just generally want to know, like, what do you think are policies for women in India in the status quo?
Paid maternity leave for a minimum of 6 months.
Yep. So the Maternity Benefit Act, other than that?
Maybe this would be difficult to implement, but basically implementation of education until grade 12 for every girl child.
Implementation of what?
Wait. Yeah, I was trying to say basically is that, give education to for children. So it should be compulsory, if possible, for a girl child to at least have education until 12th standard. So,
Okay, free education for women. Okay.
yes, one would be bring up the marriageable age to maybe 20.
Okay, so basically you're saying that, and that's a good way to do it. So I think on opposition, we can say that we need like reforms in laws so that there is better ability of females to have protections as opposed to just having gender budgeting. And that could be a really good case. So when you see that, look, in our city house, we're having concrete changes in the society, which means that people are now going to be able to, let's say, enforce it, right? Because you can't necessarily like just enforce how exactly the budget is actually going to like cater down to the people, right? Because like budgets are essentially centralized. And then when it comes to the decentralized nation like India, you would have to like so many like different layers of hierarchy, which means that at the end of the day, we don't necessarily know how exactly like the rural area, like people from rural area are going to be able to access it. But secondly, like the reason why exclusive policies are still being able to do better is so and so. So like you can just first give the example of like what exclusive policies actually look like. But I also want to like tell me one thing. What is specific in this motion, which is different in other policy motions for opposition? So this is like particularly a different motion because obviously it is a policy motion. But remember when I told you that opposition has like, no, it's not a primary burden, but like a secondary burden of giving a counter policy. What is specific with this motion, which is different for opposition in this motion?
I think it's clearly stated exclusive policy is for women. So you have to focus on that while giving your speech.
So you can't really come up with a different policy. Or like, but what you can necessarily do is like defend exclusive policies for women, but also like come up with or like give it layers of analysis to why or how exactly it's going to work. So you can still define as to what this policy is going to look like, what are the kinds of policy you can actually implement, how are you going to come up with like understanding what policies are supposed to be prioritized, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's a good answer. Yes. Cool. I think then let's just like finish this up. And what do you think is going to be the exclusive policies for women? And I think I've already told you in terms of laws that are going to be made. But again, I think we can still use the same analysis and proposition, which is like what and how the governments are essentially going to come up with exclusive policies. And I think like we can still give it a good hint of feminism. So oftentimes in not, feminists in the nations have movements running through, which means that feminists are going to go ahead and like lobby for particular changes. So a lot of times feminists go ahead and like talk about like, let's say, abortion laws and stuff like that, right? So that's the time when like government can cater to like the feminist movement in the nation and probably come up with policies which are catering to women in that particular area, which means that now you're actually listening to what like females actually want, but secondly you're also catering to the needs of women, and like therefore it's probably also like one of the greatest way to deal with democracy and stuff like that. So yeah, that's also one of the ways how you can deal with that in opposition. Yeah, so I believe like do you guys have anything else to say?
No, not really.
Yeah, no, no.
Do you all like generally hate feminist motions or just this particular motion?
No, I found it interesting. The only thing what I would is would the motion end in a deadlock? Because each time there will be equal this from both sides. So I feel this motion would end in a deadlock.
Yeah, so then it becomes on like how the whip is going to say that panel, the entire debate is a deadlock. So let me tell you why we win the debate. So it's going to be based on which whip does a better job, but I don't think it's going to end in the deadlock. Probably the way of implementation is going to end in the deadlock, but the way how like the benefits are going to accrue is still going to be different for both sides. For example, in opposition, you can still have like women going to the courts and asking for their rights, as opposed to proposition. It's kind of difficult because you know how budgeting in India works. A lot of times, like people who actually need the budget, and that's something which is not just unique to like implementation of several kinds of things. So even if like governments allocate budget to, let's say, government schools, it never reaches to them, and therefore like we know why the governments like a lot of like schools in India which are like government based aren't probably running properly, like things like corruptions and stuff like that. So like a lot of things can be like I don't know, deducted from these things, and then you can still prove why your benefits are better off. And yeah, so I think like policies are oftentimes not enforceable, and therefore, so for example, if your employer is not letting you get the maternity benefit, you can go to the court and like enforce that. But I'm unsure as to how that is going to happen in proposition. Probably you can go to the court and like ask for why exactly the administration is not working properly. But you know, like the way how both the kinds of cases work is actually different. Therefore, the way how like the redressal system is going to work is also different. So yeah, that's I think that's the way how it's going to work. Cool. I think then we can end the session, and I wish you all the best for your semifinals. But I did want to like talk to you all about